Welcome to Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharon Jutlail in Singapore. The headlines. Western leaders express outrage at a suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria. The UN Security Council is to meet later. As a US aircraft carrier sails into the South China Sea, we report on Washington's growing concerns over Beijing's growing naval power.
I'm Babita Sharma in London, also on the programme. The self-styled defender of Christian culture, Viktor Orban, is set for a landslide victory in Hungary's general election. And a marathon like no other. Runners from around the world compete on the streets of Pyongyang.
Live from our studios in Singapore and London. This is BBC World News. It's Newsday.
Good morning. It's 8 a.m. here in Singapore, 1 a.m. in London and 3 a.m. in the rebel-held town of Douma in Syria, where an apparent chemical attack has caused a global outcry. Medical aid groups are reporting that dozens of people have been killed in the town. The Syrian government and its biggest ally, Russia, deny chemical weapons have been used. But President Trump warns there'll be a big price to pay for such an attack, and the UN Security Council will meet later today to discuss the situation. Our Middle East correspondent Martin Patience has more.
This was the scene at an emergency clinic in Douma. Medics hosing down children after an alleged chemical attack. These pictures were filmed by activists on the ground. Some children were barely conscious. This baby's alive, but struggling to breathe. The medics are doing what they can, but they're overwhelmed, working in a war zone without enough medical supplies.
We received many patients who suffered from symptoms compatible with exposure to chlorine gas, high concentration chlorine gas. Also, their symptoms were deteriorating in a fashion that's not compatible with pure chlorine gas exposure. And that's why our physicians are concerned about exposure to nerve gas in low concentration.
President Trump denounced the alleged chemical attack. On social media, he wrote, "President Putin, Russia and Iran are responsible for backing Animal Assad. Big price to pay."
All agreed and have agreed since...
The White House is ruling nothing out.
So is it possible there will be another missile attack?
I wouldn't take anything off the table. These are horrible photos. We're looking into the attack at this point. The State Department put out a statement last night, and the President's senior national security cabinet have been talking with him and with each other all throughout the evening and this morning, and myself included.
Back in Syria, government troops have surrounded Douma. It's the last rebel-held town in eastern Ghouta. Both Damascus and its ally Russia describe claims of a chemical attack as fabrication, and they're prepared to take Douma at any cost. This footage was shot by Syria's civil defense, known as the White Helmets. Here, they run into the aftermath of an airstrike. They found an injured man. While the politicians talk, this is the reality in Douma. Martin Patience, BBC News, Beirut.
Well, let's stay with the situation in Syria, because state media has confirmed that the evacuation of fighters from Douma is currently underway. On Sunday, a deal was reached between the Russian military and the rebels to allow them to leave the city. Douma is the last rebel-held town in eastern Ghouta. Reports say 100 buses arrived in the town to start ferrying out some 8,000 Jaish al-Islam fighters and 40,000 of their family members. That is the latest that we're getting at the moment. Also, another line of information coming to us from the AFP news agency. This is the remarks made by the French President Emmanuel Macron, who has condemned the chemical attacks against civilians in the city of Douma. In a statement, he said he strongly condemned the chemical attacks on April the 7th against the population there, adding that the two leaders shared information confirming the use of chemical weapons, that they would coordinate their efforts at a meeting of the UN Security Council in New York. The words they're coming from Emmanuel Macron. We will, of course, have more on that. I should just say that call, referring to the two leaders sharing information, is a call that he had with Donald Trump. So more on that to come. Now, the other main story this hour, the right-wing nationalist Viktor Orban has declared victory in Hungary's general election. That was him speaking a few hours ago. Initial results show his ruling Fidesz party won nearly 50% of the vote and 2/3 of the seats in parliament. His campaign strongly opposed Muslim immigration and was fiercely critical of the European Union. So, with most of the votes counted, this is how it looks for his ruling party, receiving almost 49% of the vote. The far-right Jobbik Party has 20% and the Socialist Party received 12%. Nick Thorpe has more for us from Budapest.
Very much a party going on here at the Fidesz party headquarters. Just in the last few minutes, Viktor Orban has proclaimed victory. He said it was a historic victory for his party. He also said that they haven't got onto the place where they're heading yet, but they're on the right road. Big celebrations here then, a historic third victory. Viktor Orban himself, he's been in politics in Hungary for 32 years. He's the great survivor of the defeat of communism in 1990, and here he is with a third victory in a row, his fourth victory in his political career.
And many, Nick, are looking to Hungary as an example of how this political wave of moving to the right across Europe is taking a foothold, especially like Hungary, where the main point of conversation during the election campaign was immigration.
That's right. I mean, Viktor Orban began as a liberal, he became a centre-right figure, and now he's generally referred to as a populist or as a nationalist leader. And so he is symptomatic of this move to the right or in a nationalist direction in Europe. And I think his victory here tonight will cheer others across Europe of a similar political leaning. Geert Wilders, the far-right leader in the Netherlands, Marine Le Pen in France are great admirers of Mr. Orban, but also in this campaign he has stressed that he wants to keep Hungary in Europe, but his vision is of a very different Europe, a Europe of nations, not a Europe with many powers centred in Brussels, and certainly not a Europe where, as he feels it, the European Commission, the European Union would be lecturing him about issues like human rights and the rights of refugees, which he doesn't really accept.
Nick Thorpe there. Also this hour, US officials say North Korea has accepted the Trump administration's demand that denuclearization be on the agenda when the leaders of the two countries meet. Pyongyang has already given such an assurance in initial talks with South Korea, but according to the Reuters news agency, this is the first time it's given this kind of guarantee with Washington. Church services have been held in Canada following the deaths of 15 young ice hockey players in a bus crash. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau will attend a national vigil in the coming hours at the ice hockey rink where they played in their hometown in the province of Sichuan. Police in Germany have arrested 6 people over an alleged plot to carry out what's described as a violent crime at the Berlin Half Marathon. The German newspaper Die Welt said the accused had links to Anis Amri, who was behind the truck attack that killed 12 people at a Christmas market in Berlin in 2016. Give you an update on the golf. Have you been watching the Masters? Well, Patrick Reed has won the US Masters to land his first major title. Reed shot a 1-under par 71 that left him 1 shot clear of Ricky Fowler. It's Reed's 6th PGA Tour victory, but the first major championship of his career. All the latest from Augusta coming up this hour in Sport Today.
The battle for influence in the South China Sea is continuing to heat up. Beijing has dispatched its largest ever naval fleet to the area at the same time as a U.S. aircraft carrier heads there too. And Beijing has accused the U.S. Navy of trespassing in the South China Sea, while Washington has called China's construction of military outposts there provocative. Rupert Winfield-Hayes reports from on board the U.S. aircraft carrier, the Theodore Roosevelt.
Pilots describe what we're about to do as trying to land on a postage stamp. In the world of aviation, there is nothing harder. In the middle of the South China Sea, the crew of the USS Theodore Roosevelt is calmly going about what is a pretty extraordinary business. But it's not what they're doing that's brought me out here, it's where they're doing it.
So we're about 300 nautical miles northeast of Singapore. Over there is Vietnam, over that way is Indonesia and the Philippines. Somewhere to the north of here, a Chinese fleet has been spotted sailing south.
These satellite photos taken at the end of March show 40 Chinese ships heading to sea. In the middle, the clear outline of an aircraft carrier. The ship is the Liaoning, China's first operational carrier. It's the largest fleet China has ever sent into the South China Sea. And it's a demonstration of Beijing's growing naval power and intention to challenge America's dominance. On board the USS Roosevelt, the strike group commander is unfazed.
There is no doubt that aircraft carriers make a statement where they go, and the statement there is that we're a professional Navy, and we're here operating as we think everyone else should as well.
And we will continue to do so.
And we will continue to operate in the maritime and in the commons throughout the world. Exactly right.
But the geography of the South China Sea is changing, literally. 2 years ago, we filmed these huge new islands being built by China on 3 coral atolls. The latest photos show those islands are being turned into advanced military outposts. I asked the commander of the US Pacific Fleet how concerned he is.
Unfortunately, I think we're left with a wait and see. Without that clarity of what exactly is the intent of the establishment of such a significant military presence that really can influence the freedom of navigation throughout the South China Sea.
It will be a long time before China can challenge this sort of US naval might directly. But China's neighbors have seen its intent, and they know Beijing will never sail away across the Pacific Ocean. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News, in the South China Sea.
Now, a 30th consecutive News Poll survey in Australia shows Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's Conservative government trailing the Labour opposition. It's an embarrassing milestone for Mr Turnbull, since he used the 30 opinion poll benchmark to justify ousting his predecessor Tony Abbott in 2015. The BBC's Phil Mercer in Sydney told us what this could mean for Mr Turnbull.
Malcolm Turnbull has said that he regrets making those comments about Tony Abbott's performances in the opinion polls when he was ousting the former leader back in 2015. Tony Abbott is still agitating. He's still in Parliament. He's a backbench MP. Would he be able to mount a challenge against Malcolm Turnbull? Many people here in Australia consider Mr Abbott to be yesterday's man. There are other potential candidates, but no one leaps out at the moment. So what we have is the Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull saying that he regrets making those comments 3 years ago. He says it's business as usual and that he's the man to deliver lower taxes and more jobs to Australians. Quite clearly his government has become bogged down. Wages growth here is pretty sluggish. The scandal over Mr Turnbull's former deputy Barnaby Joyce, who was forced to resign in the last few months. Also the citizenship saga here in Australia has been a great distraction for the government. Several MPs have been found to be dual nationals. That's in breach of the Constitution. That's affected the government as well, deflecting from its economic message. And when you think of opinion polls, in many countries they're just a bit of passing interest, just a snapshot of the public mood. But here in Australia they are an integral part, rightly or wrongly, of the political theatre. So Malcolm Turnbull will have to dodge some fairly uncomfortable questions today. He says he's still the man for the job, but if MPs believe, government MPs believe, that the government might lose the next election, Mr Turnbull might have to look over his shoulder.
And that was Phil Mercer in Sydney. Well, you're watching Newsday on the BBC. Still to come on the programme, Discovering new species in the depths of the ocean. We hear from a marine scientist who's been part of a pioneering expedition.
Also on the programme, hundreds of foreign runners compete in the Pyongyang Marathon, but half the number taking part last year.
Welcome back. You're watching Newsday on the BBC. I'm Sharonjit Lail in Singapore.
Thanks for joining us. I'm Babita Sharma in London. Our top stories. Western leaders express outrage at a suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria. The United Nations Security Council is to meet in an emergency session later today.
And as a US aircraft carrier sails into the South China Sea, we report on Washington's growing concern over Beijing's growing naval power. And Japanese police have arrested a 73-year-old man suspected of keeping his son in a cage for more than 20 years in Sanda. The man is reported to have said he'd locked his son up because he had mental problems and was sometimes violent. The cage was just a metre tall. That's a story that sparked a lot of interest on bbc.com. Let's take a look now at some of the front pages from around the world now. We can start with the South China Morning Post, which reports on a tweet by President Donald Trump predicting that China will take down its trade barriers. As a potential trade war looms, the president sent a message saying that he and Chinese President Xi Jinping will always be friends, no matter what happens. Now, a stark picture showing the destruction of Mosul on the front page of the New York Times. But there's also another story about Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg, who's preparing, obviously, for the hot seat for 2 days of questioning at the US Congress. The paper says it will be like a dreaded final exam as he tries to get Congress to focus on the company's new privacy and anti-abuse measures. Finally, the Straits Times here in Singapore has an article on America's crumbling infrastructure. It makes a big contrast to Singapore's infrastructure, where most things seem to be, of course, quite shiny and new. Well, that's it for some of the papers, Babita. What are some stories sparking discussions online?
Well, Shanji, theatre goers will love this. The hip-hop musical Hamilton has won 7 Olivier Theatre Awards at the Royal Albert Hall on Sunday night in London. The show, which premiered on Broadway in New York in 2015, is about a US founding father, of course, Alexander Hamilton. It had a record-breaking 13 Olivier nominations, including Best New Musical and Best Actor.
Now, a team of scientists has just returned from a pioneering deep-sea expedition of an area where no man has gone before. These scientists have been mining the rich seascape for living treasures, diving some 500 meters to 2 kilometers deep off the southern coast of West Java. A team of 30, led by professors from Singapore and Indonesia, discovered new species and learnt more about the Earth's biodiversity. Well, earlier I spoke to Dr. Tan Koh Siang from the Tropical Marine Science Institute at the National University of Singapore about those discoveries.
It's a place where there's not much really known about the deep waters over there. So it's not unexpected to find new species, and we have found probably already 9 or 10, and we expect to find more.
All right, well, tell us a little bit more about these new discoveries.
The bigger things, I think it was easier to determine whether they were new or not. And there were some crabs and shrimps. Of course, also because our team consists quite a number of people who study crustaceans.
Right.
So they were able to determine.
They've been given quite cute nicknames, though, things like Darth Vader and what is the other one? The ice cream cone worm, as well as things like sea cockroaches. I've got to say, I hate cockroaches. But what's so interesting about these creatures?
Well, they are scavengers. The Darth Vader cockroaches are scavengers of the ocean, and they tend to live in the deeper waters. And, well, they're charismatic because they're big and they look Darth Vader-ish.
All right. Now, we were seeing some of the footage of the expedition, and it shows how a lot of the sludge from the bottom of the sea is brought up, and how, you know, you and many of the researchers are basically sifting through. It's essentially like looking for a needle in a haystack. So tell us a little bit about some of the challenges of the expedition. How difficult is it to go so deep down in the ocean?
The difficulties are mainly to do with looking through the mud. The deep waters tend to be full of mud, and the creatures live in and on the mud. So inevitably, when we bring them up, they'll be mixed up with the mud, and of course we have to sieve it through. But also these depths between 200 and 2,000 meters where we went, the equipment that we use has to be, you know, right for that depth. So we use corals, we also use trawls and dredgers as well.
India is increasing its patrol along the border with China after a tense standoff between the two countries last year over a strategic plateau called Doklam. It's claimed by both China and the Himalayan nation of Bhutan. Bharathan Etharajan reports from the capital Thimphu.
Bhutan's natural beauty is breathtaking. It's often described as the last Shangri-La, but of late there is an undercurrent of tension here. The problem is not inside Bhutan, but along its borders. Doklam, a remote but strategic plateau between China, India and Bhutan. India says any attempt by China to build a road there will be a threat to its security. But for Bhutan, the flare-up was a wake-up call.
Doklam was insignificant until it became the controversial issue it was a few months ago to most Bhutanese. Most Bhutanese don't even know where Doklam is. The majority have never been to Doklam, and it became a matter of contention and discussion only after it blew up as a controversial issue between India and China.
With the tense standoff between Chinese and Indian troops, many in Bhutan were worried that it could trigger a war between the two Asian giants. But after weeks of hectic diplomacy by the Indian and Chinese leadership, the tension was diffused.
Bhutan has been under Indian sphere of influence for decades, but the Doklam issue has divided this country, especially the youth. They want their country to chart out its own independent foreign policy. They don't want to be influenced by China, which is in the northern direction, and India, which is in the south.
India's influence in Bhutan is huge. The tiny Himalayan nation is the largest beneficiary of India's foreign aid. Hundreds of Indian troops are stationed in the country. It's a tough balancing act for the Bhutanese government, which is refusing to comment on Doklam.
Bhutan needs to actually resolve this issue with China at the earliest. That's what I feel. After that, we may be able to move forward diplomatically, or otherwise this problem is going to reoccur again. And we cannot afford to have two superpowers lock their horns at the doorstep of a peaceful nation like Bhutan.
Many here in Thimphu argue that India could have shown restraint and avoided a face-off with China. They think it might have an impact in Bhutan's efforts to solve its long-standing border dispute with Beijing. The last thing they need is Chinese and Indian armies squaring up to each other near the border. Anbarasan Ethirajan, BBC News, Thimphu.
Now, there are marathons in many cities across the world: London, Boston, Athens, and then there's one in North Korea. Rahul Joglekar has more.
It's a regime that keeps everyone on its toes. Welcome to the 5th annual marathon in North Korea that got off to a running start. More than 400 runners from across 43 countries took part. Under the watchful eye of the country's founder and his son, some runners were happy to be photographed as they ran through the streets of the capital city. At its peak, 5,000 Western tourists used to travel to North Korea for the race, but America has imposed a travel ban last year. The ongoing backdrop of nuclear tensions between North Korea and the US may have also kept some runners away. The race welcomed disabled competitors for the first time. All the races were won by locals. For a government that's in the headlines usually for its dramatic missile tests and bizarre funerals, this image of athletes running calmly on the streets of Pyongyang are relatively normal for the regime. Almost too normal, some would say. Rahul Joglekar, BBC News.
You've been watching Newsday. Thanks so much for joining us. See you soon. Goodbye.